Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. We are so excited to bring Bob Hamp back to the show. Bob is a licensed therapist and founder of the Think Different Counseling, Consulting, and Connecting Center. He has been in private practice and worked in the church for a combined 30 years of practice. Besides his service of private practice and organizational consulting, he spent 10 years developing a group discipleship strategy called Freedom Ministries to help thousands of people find freedom from a broad range of struggles. Bob explained the dynamics of abuse on podcasts 54 and 55, which are just amazing. And the 1-minute trailer, wow. It is one of our most downloaded podcasts to date, and with good reason. So welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you, guys. Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about codependency. A couple of years ago, I read a book on this topic, and I can't remember one thing that I read, which is not good. I suppose I was still in trauma brain, which so are many of our listeners. When I attend Celebrate Recovery, one of the common struggles that people talk about is codependency, and I'm always curious to learn more. So I'm hoping through this podcast, we can bring a fresh perspective and understanding to this topic.
Continuing with part 2 of Codependency with Bob Hamp.
So maybe really look at how they were before they got into that relationship and try to get back to that independent soul. Is that a good way to explain it?
I say that all the time. In fact, when somebody is finally at that point where they're saying, okay, I've got to do something different in this relationship and I've got to get well, what I tell them is I want you to think back to who you were before you met that partner.
Yeah.
If you were an athlete, tell me about your athletics. If you were a musician, tell me about your music. If you were, what were the hopes and dreams you had back then? Because as much as we don't want to go backwards, you want to go to a place where you can remember who you are.
Yes, right. You lose yourself. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And then you talk about the importance of interconnected relationships where each person has his or her own needs met and strives to meet the needs of the other person. This does not describe an abusive or destructive relationship. In our podcast with you on the dynamics of abuse, you really made that clear. And there's a big dynamic at play when the victim is carrying all or most of the responsibility of the relationship and the perpetrator does not want to carry the responsibility. It's kind of like you were saying, it's just they have this pattern with each other that they both feel comfortable with, and it's happy to let the person carry it. And so in those relationships and those type of relationships, someone's listening to this and, can maybe recognize some of these things. How can the light start going on so they can start recognizing this dynamic?
Yeah, that's a hard question because by the time you've been groomed into it, you have become invested in not seeing.
Yeah.
Or another way to say that is you've created a picture of what's happening that's less and less accurate each day.
Yes.
And it's a little bit like Plato's allegory of the cave. You're staring at the wall and the shadows on the wall and you think that's reality. And, part of Plato's allegory is you can't just turn somebody around to see actual reality. They'll freak out. It'll be overwhelming to their mind. But there's this thing that I call a progressive unveiling. I think I just wrote about it the other day on social media, but a progressive unveiling of what's actually true. And I think there are numerous things. Usually just telling somebody isn't sufficient. People have natural defenses if you sit down with them and say, I want to tell you that you're being abused. There's a natural defensiveness, that progressive unveiling that we're seeking. The question you're asking isn't going to happen because you sit down and tell somebody you're blind, you're being abused, and you don't see it.
Yeah.
They have to discover for themselves. Now, it's helpful. Honestly, I think one of the reasons why the teaching that I did on that podcast and the video that I did 6 years ago, and I've done several other people's podcasts and channels, that concept seems to make sense to people. Part of the denial that you're describing is people have a picture of abuse that's stereotypical.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't hit me. Well, he didn't hit me with a fist. He only grabbed me and shook me. Whatever it might be, there's something that they're saying. I'll tell you a story that happened years ago. I dealt with a male client whose brothers had violently attacked him and used blunt instruments in his rectum and traumatized him by trying not to be too graphic, but traumatized him. We finished the conversation. He looked at me and he goes, "I'm just glad I was never sexually abused."
Wow.
And he had just finished describing to me some of the most graphic sexual abuse you can imagine, just because it didn't involve whatever his picture was. He thought he wasn't sexually abused. And so people have to have an opportunity to discover. I think one of the reasons why the concept that I teach in that is so crucial is because it's not about behavior. It's about dynamic.
Yeah.
It's about that misplacement of responsibility. And it's kind of like the old Jeff Foxworthy thing. You might be a redneck if. You might be codependent. Do you think you're a special helper that you just need to get better at helping? Then maybe that's not really what's happening. And so some of that teaching kind of sneaks up on people and says, I'm not going to tell you you're being abused, but what I'm going to tell you is you might think you're a special helper. And if you think you're a special helper and just need to help more and help stronger and come up with new strategies to help, then you may actually be being abused.
Yeah, that's
you
good.
feel responsible for the other person and they don't take responsibility for themselves. And so if you're sitting with somebody, you might just ask them those kinds of questions. Hey, do you ever feel like maybe you're responsible for things that actually they're responsible for?
Yeah.
They expect you to carry the emotional burden in the relationship.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like you're the one who's doing all the helping and they're never doing the helping for you? Those kind of questions can at least, I think questions get through denial a little bit more easily.
Yeah, they do. They're more easy to recognize.
Yeah. He would never let me talk about anything about how I felt, how my day went, anything, because that was toxic. Like I couldn't even be a person at all. Robot that just did things. Talk about how the lower midbrain is where the addictions live. With codependency, it is an emotional addiction where dopamine and adrenaline are released with the addict and the codependent. So every time you get an itch, the addict tries to fuel that itch and look to other people. In the codependent, the same part of the brain releases dopamine if they think the addict is going to be a little bit better today. The codependent believes they will be okay if the addict stops, and it urges the people around them to slide into their midbrain as well. It becomes control-based thinking. This becomes a cycle where everyone stays stuck with no growth. How can the codependent switch from the temporary rush of dopamine release to where you talk about what should be happening is the limbic system should be releasing oxytocin, and that's what our body actually needs? Can you go?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking that question. Let me give the big picture principle. And then
I want to know the answer. I want to be able to get that, release of oxytocin in my limbic system and also be able to use my top part of the brain more as well. So go ahead.
It's the $1 million question. It's the question that people ask me all the time, whether it's about the relationship or whether it's about a substance they're dealing with or a habit that's addictive in their life, whatever it might be, is how do you get off the dopamine rush and into that oxytocin? And I'm going to give the simple answer first, and then I'm going to talk about what that actually means. The difficult part is you have to starve the dopamine and feed the oxytocin. So I always say that dopamine is like sugar and that there's a rush and a crash. There's a sudden rush that's short-lived, and then there's an immediate crash. And the crash always goes lower than where you started the first time. So when you're cycled with sugar, you always want, if you had 3 M&Ms, tomorrow you need 5. And if you had 5 tomorrow, then tomorrow you need 6 bags. Sugar always calls for more of it in order to feel the same way you felt with less yesterday. Dopamine is the same way, and that's why it fuels addictions. We talk about the midbrain, still the bottom half of the brain. So in that very instinct driven, not problem solving, not relational, not communicative, none of those kind of things, just instinct driven. That dopamine is, I have an appetite that I need to satisfy. And for both the addict and the codependent, the dopamine is more about an emotional need than a physical need.
Right.
Most addicts would say, I don't pursue my substance or behavior because of the way it makes me feel. I do it because of what it prevents me from feeling.
Yeah, that's good.
It's like numbing out.
I don't want to feel lonely. I don't want to feel like a failure. I don't want to feel isolated. And so my addictive process, whether it be codependency or substance or behavior dependency, it's fueled by a desire to not feel painful emotions. And so that dopamine, which is a painkiller and pleasure producer, is an immediately satisfying rush that tomorrow asks for more of the substance and creates more of the negative emotions. And so what ends up happening is it's a self-maintaining cycle of self-destruction. Tomorrow I need more, and to get more, I need to do more of the thing I hate myself for doing. But I do it in order to get relief from feeling the way I feel. But when I crash again, I feel that way again. Now I need more than the last time. So what happens, and here's the key for the codependent gets their dopamine hit, not just when they think the addict is doing better, but when they think they're the one who got them to do better. Remember the special helper?
Yeah.
Right? As a special helper, that's what pushes the button on my dopamine pump. I found the answer.
Right.
The victim, the codependent, will be the one who's looking for help. The addict is the one who's trying to avoid connection. And so because they're trying to avoid that, they're not looking for help. They're looking for isolation or some kind of cutoff. Well, the codependent is going, I want to be the one to get you to come connect. And if I can get you to do that, that's where my dopamine hit comes.
Right.
So
they're getting dopamine rush from thinking that they're helping.
Right. So if they get that hoovering behavior, it feels incredibly satisfying. It's why it's so hard for somebody in that stage to be leaving, is when the addict hoovers, when the abuser hoovers, in other words, tries to pull them back in by temporary improved behavior, it feels to the codependent like they have achieved their goal, and dopamine just floods their system.
So they temporarily feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I also want to stick into this part of the conversation, the previous conversation we had about the avoidant versus the anxious attacher, and say the answer is the same for the anxious attacher as it is for the codependent in this. And that is, you starve the dopamine and feed oxytocin. Oxytocin, as you mentioned, comes from the limbic system, and it both comes from connection and it fosters connection. And so where dopamine is a self-maintaining cycle of shame and negative behavior, oxytocin produces a self-maintaining cycle of connection. And here's the trick. It can't be about connecting to the other person who's withholding connection as part of their cycle. Because oxytocin is released when connection happens. You have to get the connection cycle in sequence. So two things. Number one, you're starving the dopamine, but you've got to learn how to feed the oxytocin. The oxytocin comes from making three connections. Connection number one, connect to yourself. Often Christians struggle with that because they think, aren't I supposed to connect to God first? But connecting to self is like when you're disconnected from yourself, it's like a lamp whose cord is cut off. You can plug it into power, but the power doesn't get to where it needs to get to. So we can't connect to God if we're not connected to ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. If we don't know ourselves. Yeah.
I'm disconnected from my own heart. There is no other connection that can happen. But what happens is in the dopamine cycle, I'm disconnecting because it gets so painful. I disconnect because of the pain. So there's this hump that we have to get over. That's starve the dopamine, stop chasing the hit, even though that means you're going to go through withdrawal, and learn to feed oxytocin. And here's the tricky part. If you've been pursuing connection with an abusive or avoidant spouse, you might get dopamine hits from their momentary connection, but that will pass again. And even if it was supposed to be oxytocin, it plunges you right back into the dopamine cycle. So the connection to self, one of the reasons that's so crucial is because you are in charge of that and nobody else.
Wow.
That's why they have Al-Anon meetings for
Right.
people that are married to an alcoholic or something.
So all I was getting was dopamine rushes in my marriage because he would act like a human being for a little while, but I was so disconnected to myself because I was like a robot. I wasn't even human anymore. So I wasn't connecting to myself. I did think I was connecting to God, but I kept asking God, make this real for me.
Yeah.
So I knew there was a disconnect with God, but it's because I wasn't connecting with myself. So all I was getting was dopamine rushes. So I get now what you're saying. So the first thing is connecting with ourselves. And what were the other two things?
Connect to God and then connect to safe people. So I'm going to hit all three of those for a moment, but let me go back and say it's important to recognize that starving the dopamine has to happen. And it's literally like trying to quit sugar. There is a withdrawal from dopamine. There is a withdrawal from your cycle of dopamine that says, I want to scratch that itch so badly, but I'm going to refuse to do it. And I'm going to sit with myself and learn how to, inside my own soul, begin the flow of oxytocin by reconnecting to me. Here's the trick with reconnecting to self. We disconnect from self because of pain or discomfort. And when we begin to reconnect, we reconnect to the things that made us disconnect in the first place. So if we disconnected from self because of pain, when we reconnect, that pain is still waiting for us. If we disconnect from self because of loneliness, when we reconnect, that loneliness is still waiting for us. In other words, you can't go around, you have to go through.
Okay. Yeah.
You have to deal with the hard things. So connecting self, people often say, what does it mean to connect with yourself? And I tell them, it literally means to stop and pay attention to what's happening inside of you.
Yeah.
What needs do I have? What am I experiencing physically? What am I experiencing emotionally? And don't run away from it. Engage it. And that's where the pain of re-engaging, the pain of reconnecting is almost inevitable. So that first hump we have to get over is both starving dopamine and reconnecting at a point where it's not going to immediately be oxytocin. We have to stay with it until it starts to work.
That's great.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So when I was researching for this podcast, trying to understand what is codependency exactly, I came across this article that was talking about 6 characteristics. It was on this article that said Codependent Anonymous. I guess I didn't know there was a Codependent Anonymous World Fellowship, but that's where I got this characteristics from. And it said some of the characteristics are difficulty identifying feelings, difficulty making decisions, harshly judging everything they think, say, and do is never good enough, doesn't perceive themselves as lovable or worthy of love, puts aside their own interests and hobbies in order to do what others want, and compromises their own values and integrity to avoid rejection or others' anger. And so this article I was reading was saying all these characteristics is someone that's been in some type of an intimate partner abuse. They can be very much like that. So I just was curious what your thoughts were on that.
This is a crystal clear picture of how we are formed by our relational mirrors. Right. So we get to know who we are as a child by the way that we're mirrored back to us by our significant people, mom, dad, grandparents, the people who are most important in our lives, what they mirror back to us. So you gave a list of 6 things. Let me tell you the mirrors that would form those things. Right. So if you have difficulty identifying feelings, that shows that your feelings were never validated. Mm-hmm. You learn your feelings when somebody looks at you and says, oh, you must be so sad. When someone says, wow, you must really be angry. And if people don't validate your feelings, then we struggle through our developmental years. We don't learn to identify our feelings. Difficulty making decisions comes when we're not trusted or empowered by the caretakers in our life. If they're always doing things for us, we don't learn to do for ourselves. If they don't hand us responsibility and initiative, then we simply are dependent on the decisions of our caretakers. So we have a hard time making decisions because we were never given the authority to do that. We judge ourselves as never good enough because we were never treated as good enough. We were not valued, right? We don't perceive ourselves as lovable because we were used and not loved. We put aside our interests and hobbies in order to do what others want because our needs weren't met. Our needs were only met when we took care of somebody else first. And we compromise our values and integrity to avoid rejection because our whole life was formed around somebody else needed something. So that's how I got a sense of who I was. So whatever values I have a primary value that says other people matter more. Mm. Those relational mirrors. And so what you just described is that some people, right? Some people will say those relational mirrors maybe didn't take place in your family of origin. But if you've been in a chronically abusive relationship and spent time being not validated, not trusted, not empowered, not valued, not loved, you come to believe about yourself things that are very different than what you once believed about yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be very similar. Like, yeah, that's feeling that way.
Oh, yeah.
For
I
sure.
felt like that for sure. Now, you give some examples, you and your wife give some examples of how to shift our thinking by learning a new way to communicate, that you are no longer responsible for the other person's addiction. You will no longer tell them what to do. And some of those examples were, I love you so much. I'm no longer going to let you hurt yourself or me. I'm no longer going to be responsible for that. Number 2 example that you give, I'm not going to be a crutch that keeps you from developing into the powerful, strong soul you were made to be. And then the 3rd example you give is, I want you to become the best version of yourself, and I might be getting in the way if I'm always taking responsibility. The response is usually that the addict or abuser will say that you're being mean. Can you explain to our listeners why the addict says you're being mean and how to overcome this common response?
First of all, those 3 examples, it's kind of a tricky thing because you have to think that way to say those things, and you have to say those things to think that way. When we are enabling somebody else in those ways, we have a disordered picture of love. We think it's loving to help them avoid pain, when the question is, whose pain is it? If it's their pain, you can't really take it away from them. You can only numb them. And so the thing is, it's not loving to numb somebody when they could actually do something about their pain. I see this often with parents who don't want their kids to fail at school, or they don't want their kids to experience something painful. And so the parents soften the blow or even carry the weight for them. I know so many parents that do their kids' schoolwork for them so they quote unquote don't fail. And so we've evolved to have a definition of love that says, I'm going to keep you from feeling pain. And when 2 people have lived that dance long enough, one person has the expectation, oh, you're going to carry the pain. I don't have to. And I always use the picture. It's like, listen, I can't do push-ups and your biceps get stronger.
Yeah.
There are certain things that each person must do for themselves. You can't gain a benefit from somebody else's physical exercise. Each person must do their own exercise. So there's this shift that somehow has permeated our culture that says love means keeping somebody else from hurting, when there are times when keeping somebody else from hurting is actually the least loving thing that we can do if they haven't owned their pain enough to know how to do something about it.
Yeah.
There's this it's funny, but it's deadly sometimes. There's a verse that people quote all the time, especially, and here's what happens with that addict or that person, the abuser who gets angry about this. They look at them and say, the Bible says to bear one another's burdens. And what they've been doing is they've been presuming on a concept that says you're supposed to carry my weight. There's an internal expectation that the other person is responsible for them. And so when they stop taking responsibility, that person actually feels betrayed or in some way insulted that the other person stopped doing something they should have never done in the first place. But here's what a lot of people don't know, that Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens. A lot of people don't realize that Galatians 6:5 says, but each person should carry their own weight.
Yeah, very important part of that.
Yeah, that's good.
Goes together.
And there's a difference between burdens and weight, right?
Yeah.
Burdens are, perhaps you can't carry this alone, so you need both of us to work on it. But weight this is yours.
Yeah.
You are responsible for this. And if I carry this for you, I'll actually do you harm, not help.
And so that's why the abuser or the addict gets so mad, or they say you're being mean when you try to do that.
Right. They think you're pulling out from under them something that they have the right to. They think you are responsible. And so when you stop, quote unquote, taking responsibility for them, they believe you're shirking something you are responsible for.
Well, you also explain that this is how God operates. He's not mean. He's incredibly loving, and he will not take responsibility for you, me, or anyone else. You also use an example of Jesus saying, do you want to get well? You explain that if someone can do something and it is their responsibility and that they are capable, that we need to let them do it. You need to allow someone to grow into an independent, strong soul. Can you expound on the importance of only helping a person with the things that they cannot carry?
Absolutely. The importance of only helping a person with the things they can't carry is it helps them develop the capacity and the expectation of carrying what they are designed to carry. It's the same principle of, if you want to get stronger, I can't do the exercise for you. And if you're expecting me to do the exercise for you, I will get stronger, but you'll actually not. And if you think I was supposed to, you'll be angry at me for it. I tell this story often about when my kids were much younger and I would go to pick them up from daycare. There was this young woman who had twin boys, and she was probably 5'2", 110 pounds, maybe. And if I'm insulting her by saying that, I apologize. Of course, I have no idea where she is today, but she had twin boys. And when I first started seeing her walk out with these twin boys, she'd have a diaper bag over each shoulder and a boy on each hip, and she was carrying them to the car. Well, I'd watch over the next 2 years while she's still diaper bag on each shoulder and a boy on each hip. And this petite young woman carrying these babies, the babies got big and chunky, and then they got to be toddlers. But I would still see her carrying them out, one on each hip, and she's literally starting to stagger under the weight of these twin boys. And I thought, why is she not just letting them walk? I mean, she's not letting them walk. And so one day I was inside when she arrived, and I discovered the answer to my question. I saw those two boys running around like all the other 2.5-year-olds in class. They were running around, jumping, playing. But at the minute that mom walked in the room, they both plopped down on their butts, put their hands in the air, and stopped using language and started making guttural sounds.
Wow.
And mom jumped right in and just didn't ask them to talk, didn't ask them to walk. She got their diaper bags and she put them up on her hips and walked out the door. As far as I know, those boys are now 23 years old and probably still being carried around by their mom.
I hope not.
But that's, what happens.
That's the importance of not doing it.
Yeah.
People will develop the capability to do what you expect them to do, but it's clear that you don't expect them to do it if you demonstrate that you're already planning to do it. Let me just tell my own story. My oldest son is 37. He has Down syndrome. And he's being the oldest. We were kind of discovering along the way what he is and is not capable of. And at age 3, he learned to tie his shoes. But at age 7, I was still tying his shoes. You know why? He was the slowest shoe tire. And I don't know if you think about this, but every time you're getting a kid to tie their shoes, it's because you're going somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he discovered if he takes too long, I'll just do it for him.
Yeah.
So for 4 years of it being his responsibility, I was still doing it for him until I thought to myself, I wouldn't let a client do this.
Yeah.
Right.
So I just began to plan enough time. We're about to leave 15 minutes from now.
Yeah. I remember that stage too, because you have to have a lot of patience.
Yeah.
Right.
When they're learning to read or anything like that, you just want to say the word for them. So you mentioned that letting the child fail and have consequences is important for when they get into the real world. And at home, I know I can struggle. I just have my youngest living with me, but he's 19. And I know even with him, sometimes I struggle with giving him firm consequences, like when I don't feel like he's cleaned up after himself, like in the kitchen, or just not helping out more around the house. And I think that a lot of parents can struggle with that. So do you have any helpful advice for that?
Well, do you know what consequences to give and you just don't want to do it, or you're not sure what kind of consequences?
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 3 of Codependency with Bob Hamp. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening. And until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.